Hello and welcome to this evening's presentation on the effects of sensory integration therapy on the frequency of self-injurious behavior and the implications for teachers of students who display self-injurious behavior. SIB for short, self-injurious behavior, is any behavior or activity that harms an individual, anything that we could do to do harm to our own bodies. We see this sometimes in the form of cutting or burn marks. Who does this? Well, most frequently, according to the National Institute of Health, it's most prevalent in persons with severe to profound mental retardation. That's the term they use. I feel more comfortable saying cognitive disabilities. So how many people are we talking about? According to the Merrill Advanced Studies Center, between 5 and 17% of persons with cognitive disabilities engage regularly in self-inflicting tissue damage. So even if that's just 5%, that's a huge number, and there's a good chance that as a teacher of special education students that we'll see eventually a student who exhibits self-injurious behavior. Why do they do this? Well, there are various functions of behavior, things like attention, sensory, escape, etc. And so it could be any of those functions. For the purpose of this exploration, the researchers have tackled the idea that the primary reason for it is as a sensory function. And why it's important for us to think about that, well, that's time that they could be spending on other areas, such as social development, academic skills, communication skills, and that sort of thing. So it's super important for us to be aware of how to reduce self-injurious behavior so that we have that time to spend on other skills that we work on in school. It's also our ethical responsibility to make sure that we're providing a safe, warm climate, fulfilling the hierarchy of needs so that our students, those engaging in self-injurious behavior, as well as the other students around the students engaging in that behavior, have a chance to learn as optimally as possible. So these researchers came up with the idea that for those students, those children and adolescents with severe, pervasive developmental delay or cognitive disabilities, what happens if we give them some sensory integration interventions? Will that reduce the frequency that they engage in self-stimulating and self-injurious behavior? They included self-stimulating because that's the premise here that they're going with, that self-injurious behavior is in itself a self-stimulating sensory tool. So how can we do this? Well, the researchers said, let's take some students. We'll take 4 boys, 3 girls. These students all go to the same school, the same facility. One actually lives there at this center. And we will give them a test. A pencil and paper test? No, it is the Sensory Integration Inventory revised for students with developmental disabilities. You can imagine how a pencil and paper test might go. These students are all between the ages of 8 and 19 years old, and all have severe to profound cognitive disabilities. So once they had this information in regard to which sensory activities each student liked the best, they didn't use them. Instead, they came up with a baseline. Week 1, they had 1 teacher and 3 occupational therapists not involved with the study take data on these students and say, how often are these students engaging in self-injurious behavior? They did that by using a check sheet. Every 15 seconds, they were monitoring the students, and anytime one of the students used self-injurious behavior, they would put a check by that student's name. So they had their data. Week 2, they begin the sensory intervention therapy at the rate of 30 minutes each day, and they took notes 15 minutes before that therapy, immediately after the therapy, and then 1 hour after the therapy. And they recorded 15-minute sessions, and during those 15-minute sessions, they broke out their check sheets again for their 15-second intervals and took data the way they had during week 1. Why did they do that way? Well, with only 7 students, they didn't have enough for a separate control group, so week 1 serves as the control group. It's the same students, but week 1 they do not receive the therapy. Week 2 they do. Week 3 they do not, and that same teacher and those same 3 occupational therapists took data the same way. And then in week 4 they get the therapy again at the same rate, 30 minutes each day. The same choices that they had made on the inventory, they used those exactly the same from week 2 to week 4. They were different between the students because each student's preferences were different, but based on what those students chose, they kept those activities the same for each student between week 2 and week 4. So what happened? Well, in week 1, they developed a baseline. Approximately 8% of those 15-second intervals housed self-injurious behavior. That's an average between all of the students. That means at any given time, any particular student, you could pick out any one of those 7, and the average would be 8% of those 15-second intervals would have some sort of self-injurious behavior. In week 2, once they began the therapy, that dropped by approximately 8%. In week 3, although the students did not have therapy, that still maintained a 3% decrease from week 1. And in week 4, when they did the therapy for the second week, students dropped from week 1 by approximately 13%. They averaged week 2 and week 4 together because those were not the control groups. Those were not the control weeks, and so they averaged that together and found approximately an 11% decrease from week 1 to week 4. This is that same information, but just placed in a little more linear fashion. From week 1, we could really think about that as being 0 instead of 8, so that you see that there's not quite such a drastic drop from week 1 to week 2. You can really think of that as being 0 for their average, and then down 8%. So we're about to scrunch this upward so that we can put another graph under that. And let's do that now. This graph that you see now is now the top graph in this picture. The bottom graph system, let's take a look at series 1 first, the blue line. This was one of the outliers. That student had a below average self-injurious behavior compared to the class on week 1, and then during week 2, during the therapy, it actually increased their rate of self-injurious behavior. Week 3, we saw a huge decline, down below the 20%, approximately 20% decrease, which is still about a 12% decrease for that student between week 1 and week 3. And then in week 4, when we brought the therapy back, it jumped back up to their original week 1 number. The series 2, where you see those peach squares, is another student who started above the class average, about 10%. Week 2, when we began the therapy, it dropped a little bit, or it actually increased, it actually increased a little bit. And then in week 3, we saw a big decline. And then week 4, back up, but even higher than they had been in week 1. The student you see in blue, series 1, with those blue diamonds, their average landed below where they started, or below the class average for week 4. Because of that huge decline from week 2 to week 3, I wonder what this would have looked like if they had continued the study for 8 or 10 weeks. I wonder if that student would have showed an overall decline then. But Series 2, the peach boxes, that student might have a function other than sensory needs, feeding their desire for self-injurious behavior. That might not work for that student. We might need to find something else to help get rid of their self-injurious behavior. About me, I'm teaching at the elementary and middle school level at a center school. I've been doing that for 2 years now. Our center school has students with autism, has a lot of students with other health impaired, rare genetic disorders and that sort of thing. We also, one of the prerequisites to go to our center school is some pretty severe behavior, and we do see self-injurious behavior as part of that, which makes sense if you take a look at the bell curve for intelligence. Our students land about here, and what we know is that students in the severe and profound range are those most likely to engage in self-injurious behavior, and indeed we do see some of that at our school. So this is directly applicable to me as a teacher, and so let's take a look at that. When they get to our school, according to the RTI model, they're already in Tier 3. They were introduced to school with their typically developing peers, non-disabled peers, most of them. They were given Tier 1 supports in class, Tier 2, some small group pull-out, that sort of thing, and they moved into Tier 3 rather quickly. We saw that these students were particularly unresponsive to the supports that we were offering, and most of those moved into a self-contained unit, and still perhaps because of the smaller ratio that's required for their needs, still didn't do so well with those, and so they came to us at the center school. When we got them, we began with some baseline tests. We incorporated several supports, and we keep that testing going. We keep that data running, keep track of, are they meeting the goal, are we closing that achievement gap, and all of that good stuff. Once in a while we run into some problems. The beautiful part about working at a center school is that there are people who've been doing instruction at this level of intensity for a good long time, and they know a lot, and you can go to them and ask for help, ask for support. We're not afraid to ask a behavioral therapist to come in, or an occupational therapist, physical therapist, or for a functional behavior analysis if we can't nail it. And so we get those supports, and then we go back to the drawing board, take our data, come up with supports that we think might work, continue to take data, see if they're working, are we meeting our goal to close that achievement gap, and then each year we go back. We say, well, are they ready to be moved back out of the center school environment? For some students that's just not possible, and so this cycle continues, but that's always the goal. When we're developing these goals for our students, we're looking at what skills do they need so that we can change their least restrictive environment from the center school to maybe a self-contained class at a school that has non-disabled peers. So if we could decrease the amount and frequency of self-injurious behavior, that might be the boost that we need to get these students back out into regular schools, into ESE classes at regular schools. So super important that we consider these findings and other findings like this, because that's a bit of a raise. If you take 8% of the time they're engaged in self-injurious behavior, and you decrease that by 11%, well, that's about a 1% raise that we can spend on things like academics, social instruction, communication instruction, daily living instruction, all of those good things that are really necessary in order to change their least restrictive environment and optimally improve their quality of life in the long term. So, in closing, I'd like to leave you with a little clip on YouTube that I found of a mother whose son is autistic and shows some signs of self-injurious behavior. She has come up with a sensory way of dealing with that, but at the end of the clip I want you to listen because she actually talks about two possible functions that she's fulfilling in order to redirect him away from that behavior. So here we go.
Okay, a lot of times Jamie starts tapping and banging on the seat. And so we've tried to find ways to stop this. You know, I've tried this, I've tried massaging his hand, and he just gets frustrated. And then, you know, I'll go to get the food again, and he keeps on doing it. So what I came up with is I thought, okay, before we have the handheld vibrator, but the problem is sometimes he'll hold it and then he'll just toss it. So I thought, okay, how can I keep it in his hand so that it's contained in his hand? So what I found is these mitts, actually from the 99-cent store, and I turn on the handheld vibrator, I put it inside the mitt, and then I wrap it on his hand. Okay, make sure you get this. Okay, just if you can get his hand in there real quick. Okay, now of course the danger here is that if he starts trying to hit his head with this, you've got now a hard handheld vibrator inside this mitt. But hopefully this will now contain his hand, and it redirects his mind off of doing the thump, 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 thump on the seat to the vibration on his hand, so that it gives him more control over his obsessions and his stim to do that. So now he's more relaxed. You see how he's stopped now? He's actually stopped doing the bang, 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 bang on the chair because you've got this handheld vibrator inside this contained unit, which is preventing him from throwing it. So it's really effective. It doesn't always work all the time. I'd say 80% of the time it works. Other times he starts trying to use this and hit it on his head. So you have to, obviously intervene. But it is an idea.
Thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I have. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.